I want to share with you this morning a very grim and yet radical story. You see, in 1974, there was an evil and wicked man who was also a drunk by the name of David McAllister. He worked for a company that was owned by a single individual, and he kept struggling in his work because he would show up drunk and he had a nasty disposition and caused all kinds of problems. And as you might expect, he was fired. And because he was fired, he was so angry at his boss, he was so angry at the owner of the company that he decided to exact revenge. Now, if you are an evil, wicked person, then you know that the best way to exact revenge upon someone is to hurt their children. And so this was his plan. And so sometime in late December, David McAllister planned to abduct his boss's son. His boss's son was a young boy by the name of Chris Carter. This is a picture of him here. This took place in Florida. He's walking down the street, and David McAllister approached him and said, "Hey, I know your dad," and threw out a bunch of names and basically made contact with the kid, kidnapped him, brought him into the Everglades, somewhere deep into the woods or the swamps or whatever it might be, sat him up against a tree, pulled out a gun, and shot him in the head. And then he left. Strangely enough, 10-year-old Chris Carter survived. And in fact, he laid there for some time, and then a farmer drove by, saw the body, or thought it was a body, found out the kid was alive, brought him to a hospital. And oddly enough, with a bullet passing through his skull, his mental, cognitive abilities were fully intact. The only physical consequence is that he lost the sight in his left eye. Of course, they interviewed the guy, and there was no evidence. They weren't able to prosecute. And then the evil, wicked, drunk man, David McAllister, took off, and they never saw him again. And so justice was not done. Thankfully, this little 10-year-old Chris Carter was brought up in a Christian home, was cared for, was loved. And of course, his therapy and emotional therapy must have taken some time for him to get through this, to make it through this difficult time. But by the time he became an adult, he was a fully healthy, functioning Christian, godly man who got married, who got a job, who had a career, who had children, and lived basically a normal life. This is a picture of him right there. But while he was in his 30s, something happened. The story was not yet over. He received a phone call from a detective, and told him, "We found the man who shot you some 25 years earlier. And in fact, he's in a nursing home, and he's confessed to the crime." And then the law enforcement officer said, "Do you want to go see him?" I imagine he must have been stunned. He must have been reeling. He thought this chapter was closed, and here it was reopened. And I don't know what he went through, talking to his family, his wife, his pastor, his fellow Christian brothers and sisters. Is this something that I should do? But over a period of time, he made the decision to go into this nursing home and confront this evil and wicked 77-year-old man who was on his deathbed. And so he went. And he went, and he confronted him. But the confrontation wasn't one of anger or hate or, "Oops, I accidentally unplugged this piece of medical equipment, I'm sorry." The confrontation was one of forgiveness. And there in that nursing home, Chris Carter offered his forgiveness to David McAllister for some 25 years earlier, without any cause, shooting him in the head and leaving him for dead. This is a very grim and horrifying story, and yet it shows us when God works in the heart of people, there can be such a thing as forgiveness, and there can be such a thing as loving our enemies. And so we're going to talk about that today, this concept of loving our enemies, loving people, doing good to people who have intentionally hurt us. So if you would, please open up your Bibles to Luke chapter 6, and we're going to be reading verses 24 to 36. Now, the context here is that Jesus is in the middle of his Galilean ministry. He went up on a mountaintop to pray, and when he came down, there was a large pool of disciples, and from that pool, he appointed 12 of them as apostles. And immediately when he did that, there was a multitude, there was disciples, and there were apostles before him, and he immediately began to teach them. And what this message is commonly referred to as the Sermon on the Plain. And so last week we looked at the Beatitudes. That is a series of 4 blessings. And this week we're going to look at what he says next. So we are in Luke chapter 6, starting with verse 24 from the ESV. This is what Jesus says to his apostles and what he is saying to us. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you shall be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. And woe to you when people speak well of you, for so their fathers did to the false prophets. Verse 27. But I say to you who hear, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. To the one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from the one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who begs from you, and from the one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. If you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to get back the same amount. But love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. Well, let's get into the instruction here. Jesus opened this Sermon on the Plain with a series of 4 blessings, and then he immediately parallels these 4 blessings with a series of woes. Now, what exactly are woes? We don't use this in our culture. We don't walk around saying, woe is me, woe is that, woe to you. We don't say that. But a woe is essentially a warning. It's a denunciation. It's a statement of grief. And in this context, it's the opposite of a blessing. And we can note the obvious parallelism here in this passage. Blessed are the poor, woe to the rich. Blessed are the hungry, woe to the full. Blessed are those that weep, woe to those who laugh. Blessed are those when people hate you, and woe to you when people speak well of you. What exactly is Jesus saying here? Is he really angry and warning people who have a full stomach or have a decent-sized bank account or who are happy? Is he really getting on to us for these sorts of things? Now remember, he's teaching his disciples, and the context here is the cost of following Jesus. And so his disciples, they may be poor, they may be hungry, they may be destitute based upon the testimony of the gospel, but they will be blessed in a special way during their time of suffering, as we examined last week. But concerning the woes, he's instructing the same disciples. Now, why would his disciples be rich and full and laughing and people speaking well of them? The key is in verse 26. The possibility is that his disciples could be rich, could be full, could be happy, and the crowd could speak well of them. And what's wrong with that? Well, the crowd spoke well of the false prophets. In other words, the way his disciples can be full, can be rich, can be happy, and have a good reputation is either to function as a false prophet or to cave on the message. He's saying, if you're going to follow me and speak the gospel, you're going to be blessed. Even though you might be poor, hungry, and weep, and people are bad-mouthing you. However, woe to you if you're going to be rich, full, and happy, and have a good reputation, because the only way you get that is if you water down the message like one of the false prophets. And so he contrasts the two paths that his disciples can take. Speak the gospel, you may be poor, hungry, weeping, but blessed. Distort or soften the gospel, and you may be rich, full, laughing, but also cursed. His message here is that I'm sending you out with power to preach the gospel, and you can use your skill to tickle the ears of the people, and you can be rich and popular, or you can deliver the full counsel of God, and you may pay the price. Those that deliver the gospel are blessed, and those that water it down, woe to you. So he immediately moves into a new section which actually corresponds with the blessings and woes. So in verses 27 to 36, Jesus teaches his disciples that we're to love our enemies, or we're to have a love of our enemies. Now, this matches perfectly with what he said, because he's already mentioned two groups of enemies, two groups of people that are present in this story. The first group is the ones who are persecuting them because of the gospel. The ones that are causing them to be poor, to be hungry, to be weeping, and to have a bad reputation. And the second group are the ones who are watering down the gospel to make it more palatable for the crowds. These people are going to hurt you. And this is how we ought to respond. Now let's break down Jesus' argument. First, in verse 27, we have a statement of principle. The statement of principle, Jesus says, love your enemies. Well, that's kind of vague. That could mean a lot of things. What exactly does he mean? Well, thankfully, he gives us some examples. So in verses 27 and 28, how do we love our enemies? He says, do good to those that hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. And I think number 3 is perhaps most important, because sometimes we can't do good and we can't bless those that have hurt us because we might never see them again, but we can always pray for them. Now, these first 3 examples seem both reasonable but still difficult. And this is very similar to Paul's instruction in Romans 12. He says, beloved, never avenge yourself, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Paul says the same thing. You overcome evil by doing good. Now, the next few examples are problematic. Remember that the principle is love your enemies, and then he gives us some examples. He has 4 more examples to give, and these examples are anti-intuitive, and in fact, they are outright unreasonable. This is what he says, verse 29, you're to turn the other cheek. Someone punches you, you give them the other side. Someone offers to take your clothing, give them some more. Anyone who comes to you and begs, give them whatever they want. And if someone steals from you, don't demand back the stolen goods. Now, if these statements are to be taken at face value, then Christians are quite limited. You cannot use self-defense during an assault or a mugging or to protect your family. And in fact, we're to be pacifists. If someone tries to steal from you, don't hinder them. In fact, you should just give them more. And you must necessarily give to anyone who asks of you. And if you catch someone with your stolen goods, don't ask for it back. Now, if these statements are true and to be taken as literal, then we are off track as a church. Why do we have an alarm system here? Why do we have locks on the doors? We have taken great lengths to have high levels of industry standard safeguards for our finances here, meaning the way we handle the money, the way we deal with the money, checks and balances, because this is your money. We have all of these things in place. Why do we do that? If somebody wants to steal, let them steal. We were robbed a few years ago in this very building. Why did we call the police then, according to this passage? Well, I believe that Jesus is employing a common literary device here, something called hyperbole. That is an exaggeration to drive home a point. He's exaggerating this principle to show that we ought to go to great lengths to love our enemies. And this may include, at times, and with wisdom, letting someone get away with robbing us or not fighting back after being struck. Now, he summarizes his teaching again in verse 31. He says, "Do unto others as you would have them do to you." So in these last couple of verses, he's given us examples, and in the next section, he's going to give us a statement of consequences. If you love those who love you, what benefit is that? Even sinners do that. Even sinners love. Even sinners do good. Even sinners lend money at no interest to the people they love. So in verse 35, he restates it. He says, love your enemies, do good, lend at no interest. But in verse 35, we have the ultimate consequences. He says, your reward, if you put this into practice, your reward will be great. You will be sons of the Most High. And then he says on the nature of God that he is kind to the ungrateful and evil. I like that passage. He's kind to the ungrateful and evil. You ever ungrateful? You ever struggle with being ungrateful? Why can't I have this? Why can't I have more? Why does this person have that and I don't have the same thing? It's easy to struggle with that. And yet he's kind to the ungrateful and to the evil. And the final principle is found in verse 35. The final principle of all of this is to be merciful because he is merciful. Now, if I were to summarize all of this teaching in the most succinct way, I would summarize it like this. God is merciful. He therefore loves his enemies. Most people aren't merciful, and we should be like God, and that is love our enemies. Now, if I could summarize this into one statement, it is be merciful because God is merciful. So he is merciful, and he wants us to act the same way. Now, this brings us to a few points of application, and the first one is that we really have to understand the nature of God's mercy. This whole section is predicated on the nature and the character of God. What is made clear is that his disciples should not live a certain way because some sort of arbitrary wave of moralism. They're not to do this because this is a popular way of doing things. No, they are doing this because this is based upon the very nature and the character of God. What do we know of God? Well, look what the psalmist says. Psalm 103, the Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. How much love does he have? His love abounds. Psalm 145, the Lord is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, abounding, there's that word, in steadfast love. The Lord is good to all. What about the jerks? What about the robbers, the thieves, the gossips, whatever it might be? He's good to all. And his mercy is over all that he has made. You see, this isn't just how God expresses himself. He doesn't just show grace and compassion. He is those things. But if you look back at verses 35 to 36, he is kind and merciful because this is who he is. This is his very nature. And it reminds us then that the world should not be our standard of morals. You see, the world presents an odd assortment of ever-changing and hypocritical morass of flimsy moral standards. If you go back just a few generations ago in the 50s and the 60s, and I'm not attempting to unpack these and discuss them, but just as an example, in the 1950s and 60s, homosexuality was considered wrong. It was illegal. It was considered a mental disorder by the contemporary psychological experts at the time. Back then, porn was heavily regulated and considered to be immoral by the average person. Cross-dressing or transgenderism was considered a mental illness according to the psychologists, the experts at the time. The consumption or possession of marijuana was a felony, heavy consequences for that. And now, some 60 years later, all those moral standards have been turned around. How can we discern what is right or wrong, immoral or moral, with all of this ethical whiplash? You see, the world presents an odd assortment of ever-changing and hypocritical morass of flimsy moral standards. The world loves revenge stories. We think of movies or shows like The Punisher. We think of The Count of Monte Cristo. We think of, well, you can name many stories and movies about revenge. We love the story of a man who's hurt by a mob boss, and then that man goes and becomes a one-man wrecking crew and takes out the whole lot of them. We love a good revenge story, and we love it because we know what it feels like to be hurt. But this is not the way of the cross. Amidst the cultural whiplash, are there universal standards of right and wrong? And the answer is yes. They come from our Creator. He created the heavens and the earth, and He gets to set the standard, and His ethics are not arbitrary. They're based upon His character. And so in this passage, because of the very nature of God, we are told to love our enemies as a moral and ethical practice because that's what He does, and that's what He did for us. By the way, we must also mention that God will repay evil accordingly. When Jesus says love your enemies, He doesn't mean, I'll just let bygones be bygones, just pretend it didn't happen. No. His teaching is that hatred and unforgiveness is a poison that will kill you. Look back at what Paul says. Beloved, never avenge yourselves. But then look what he goes on to say. Leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And so we don't walk around just acting like nothing bad ever happens. We're saying that unforgiveness, hatred, and bitterness is a poison that kills us, and so we're going to leave it to God to bring justice upon the people who have hurt us. You see, because no one escapes judgment. What we do on this earth matters, and God will avenge on our behalf. Now, this brings us to a significant principle, which is that this teaching is not suggesting that we have to be victims. We don't have to be victims. Jesus is not saying that we shouldn't hold people accountable, that we shouldn't call the police, that we shouldn't seek justice, that we shouldn't bring people into court, and that we should just sit back and let people hurt us and abuse us and take advantage of us. This teaching is neither pacifism nor a victim mentality. He's saying, do not repay evil with evil. We are allowed to repay evil with justice. Because there is a core principle at work here. We are to be merciful because God is merciful. So we don't have to be victims, but we ourselves are not to become vigilantes. Now, what does this do? If we truly take this principle and begin to live this way, which I will confess is not easy, and I'm not so sure how well I even have this down. One of the things this does is this allows us to evade a life of bitterness. If you want to live a miserable life of anger and depression and rage, then hold on to that grudge. Hate someone. And you will have exactly that, a life of hate. I remember the first time I saw a dead body. Long story. I was supposed to move the body from a bed into a gurney. This is all legal, by the way, just in case you're wondering. So I came into this room, I opened the door, and there's this guy, and he's in bed, and of course he's dead. And he's got a full head of hair. And it's not even fully gray. He's got some color, and then he's got this real thick gray mustache. And he's laying there, of course, dead. And later on, I would preach his funeral. and hardly anyone showed up. And the word I got from his family was that this was an angry, bitter man. No one liked him, and no one mourned his death. And the 5 or 6 relatives that showed up were there just out of respect for the loss of a family member. Apparently, he treated his dog better than he treated his family. But what caught me off guard when I walked in and seeing this body, this shell of what was once a man, is that his eyebrows were gnarled and he had this scowl frozen on his face. And even in death, the last facial expression that he had was an angry, bitter scowl, and that was frozen on his face. And I don't think God wants us to live that way, where we spend our lives being angry and bitter and scowling, and so that when we die, that is permanently etched upon our face. This is not the abundant life that Jesus has for us. Now, being merciful certainly is about the other person, but it's also about us, because God knows what we need to live an abundant life. And when we practice this excruciatingly difficult command, we walk in the very footsteps of Jesus. You see, he told us, like himself, to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. This is what we are to do. We are to follow him. And what did they do to him? They betrayed him. They harassed him. They spat upon him. They tortured him. They put him through this fake charade of a kangaroo court. And finally, they heaped upon him a horrible and unjust death. And what were his final words? Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. And this is why Palm Sunday is so significant. Jesus entered into the city of Jerusalem like a prophet, knowing full well that they were going to kill him. He knew by entering into the city, he would need to give up his life as a ransom for many. You call yourself a Christian? You want to be like Jesus? Do I want to be like Jesus? This is how we walk in his footsteps, by loving the people that hate us. Now, when we put these difficult principles into practice, we are being salt and light into this world. We are literally changing the world. Everyone expects a counterattack. Everyone expects a response in kind. Everyone expects the conflict to escalate until one side completely obliterates the other. But one side can also say, we're done. We forgive you. Let's move on. And everything stops. My friends, when we love our enemies, we can also reach the unreachable. There are people out there whose hearts are so calcified they will never be open to the gospel. They don't care about our stupid fairy tale Santa Claus sky daddy who saves weak and foolish people. They believe religion is a crutch, it's the opiate of the masses, and they're not going to buy into this charade. They don't listen, they don't care, and you can't reach them until they see you do something inhuman, something supernatural, and frankly, something they've never seen before. God's people showing kindness to the people that have hurt them. You see, one of the reasons we can't or won't do this, and this is a hard pill to swallow, is that we truly do not understand our own depravity. You see, when you have been forgiven much, then you can in turn forgive much. And we don't forgive much because we don't view our own depravity the way God does. You see, we were depraved, soulless, rebellious creatures who, even in our best moments, would never choose God. We are wholly incapable of even scratching the surface of anything close to the holiness of God. And in our rebelliousness, in our wholesale depravity, he did something surprising. He offered a way for us to be forgiven. He offered a way for us to get back into a right relationship with our Creator. And he did so by sending his one and only Son, Jesus, to that cross to pay for what we did. Now, why? Why did he do this? His nature is to be merciful. Look back at verse 35. It says he's kind to the ungrateful and evil. This is his nature. Now, I love how the psalmist describes this again in Psalm 145:8. He says, "The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and rich in love." This is who he is. But in Psalm 103, we find out what he did. It says, "As far as the east is from the west, as far as the east is from the west, so far he has removed our transgressions from us." Now we know that the circumference of the earth is about 25,000 miles, and so half of that is about 12,450 or whatever it might be. So the distance from the east and the west is big. But they probably weren't thinking about that when they wrote this. What they're saying was that here's who I am. Here is my depravity. Here's my rebelliousness. Here's my sin. Here's my selfishness. Here's my ungratefulness. Here's my evil. Here's my stubbornness. All of the things, the pride that I have. Here's everything that I have. This is the big, fat, ugly pile of transgression that I have created on purpose. And it says the Lord has taken this mess, and he has taken it so far, he has removed it so far from me that it is as far as the east is from the west. That's how far he has removed it from us. You see, when we perceive the absolute holiness of our Creator, when we perceive the utter depravity of our own conduct, when we perceive the fact that he has removed our transgressions from us, then being merciful to someone else begins to come into focus. It starts to make sense. When we see that we have been forgiven much, then we can in turn forgive much. I want to go back to this story with Chris Carter. See, I didn't tell you the full story. After a decade and a half of living with this, and then going to this nursing home to confront this man and to forgive him, Chris Carter didn't just leave. He actually stayed and befriended this man and spent time going to the nursing home, ministering to him, caring for him. He even brought his children with him. And this is an actual picture of Chris Carter in his 30s ministering to this man who shot him when he was 10 during the last week of his life. And according to the story, after ministering to him for some time, the calcification on this evil man's heart began to fall away. He heard the gospel, responded to the gospel, and confessed Christ as Lord, and then was ushered into new life. All because one man understood the concept of loving your enemies. You see, it might be that we're tempted to place ourselves in the position of Chris Carter, to think, yeah, that's a tough position. But when I'm honest with myself, am I really Chris Carter, or am I David McAllister? My friends, God has forgiven us much. He has been merciful to us, good to us, and he wants us to go out, change the world by expressing his character, that is mercy and grace and forgiveness, to other people so that we can change the world.